Very welcome, Julia Stenzel from the Rangchung Yeshe Institute in Kathmandu at present. You have been also teaching for a long time in McGill University in Canada, and I would like to thank you for being here in behalf of the Kienze Center of Contemplative Traditions for the University of Leipzig to get into discussion of compassion, modern and ancient, its connections and transfers as they happen in time. And maybe we can discuss a bit about your research of compassion or into compassion and the different aspects of traditional practice, how practice of compassion is perceived by traditional Buddhists and how compassion practice is proven to benefit Western applicants. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. So I can start a little bit with my background. The first time that I learned about the concept of compassion in Buddhism was through a Tibetan teacher, Lama Gendun Rinpoche, who you also know. And I was convinced by the way that he interacted with people. That was compassion in action. Compassion for me means an intelligent way of dealing with suffering. So there we will have to ask ourselves, what do we mean with suffering or pain? And what do we mean by acting in an intelligent way with it? So Buddhists are known for having thought and written and explained a lot about suffering. That term includes a whole range from the most obvious ways of suffering, when you lose a loved one, when you become sick, all of that. But it includes a lot more than that. Buddhism actually talks a lot about a mental suffering that comes when faced with situations that we haven't chosen, but we cannot escape. So the whole range of mental suffering, I think, has become an important aspect also in Western societies. Mental suffering has increased a whole lot. And then Buddhists also talk about suffering in very subtle sense. The very fact of being alive is, in a way, suffering because it's painful. There's nothing we can rely on. And the many Buddhist practices that exist, in a way, they're all ways of dealing with these different forms of suffering and addressing in the very end, actually, this fundamental suffering of being. So why did I say that compassion is an intelligent way of dealing with these forms of suffering? Because they mean that as a compassionate person, I have to face all these different forms of suffering in order to be able to relate to others. And that is what I discovered in this Tibetan Buddhist master that I mentioned in the beginning, Lama Gendun Rinpoche. I had the impression that he had this capacity to show others how to experience life in a fuller way.
Well, I think very easily in our society, we might overlook that our understanding of turning towards others and of compassion is simply very much impregnated by Christian thought. We're helping others and doing things to help others to alleviate their suffering directly is the norm. Like in the Buddhist tradition, you always have the thought that, well, freeing yourself from suffering enables you of leading others to the same spot.
One of the things that I found out in my doctoral research about compassion in Indian and Tibetan Buddhist scriptures was that you can talk about something like a compassion culture, meaning that compassion pervades all practices that we find in Buddhism. But I think there's nevertheless another aspect when we look at this recent phenomenon of having secular compassion trainings, and that is that the secular programs singled out compassion because that was identified as actually a universal phenomenon that has nothing to do with Buddhism per se. It is contained in all major world religions, and nowadays neuroscientific studies showed that meditation, and especially meditation on compassion, can actually be traced through neuroscientific study. And this phenomenon was called neuroplasticity. So once it was shown that meditation and compassion meditation actually does have an influence that can be measured, then all of a sudden compassion became a scientific phenomenon. Whereas when we look into the Buddhist tradition, compassion is traditionally practiced as a triad together with loving kindness and the aspiration to achieve Buddhahood, bodhicitta. So therefore, I think it made sense that for a secular public, compassion was singled out.
Yeah. Thank you so much for providing also such detailed and very structured presentation. I think this is wonderful to get into so many aspects of compassion, Buddhist and non-Buddhist.
Thank you very much for having me, and all the best for your very meaningful program. Thank you.
Yes, that was it for today. Thank you for listening to the No Dharma Drama podcast of the Leipzig Center of Contemplative Traditions, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.